On the morning of March 12, 1986, David Ashford walked through the gates of Federal Correctional Institution Allenwood in Pennsylvania as a free man. He had served 11 years for espionage, not against his country, but allegedly for it. The charges were murky, the trial classified, and most of the evidence sealed behind national security protocols that even his own lawyer couldn't access. When the iron doors closed behind him, he carried nothing but a brown paper bag containing his civilian clothes from 1975, now hopelessly outdated, and a check for $217 in release funds. The sky was gray. The air smelled like wet asphalt and diesel fuel. And for the first time in over a decade, David Ashford was nobody's property. He took a Greyhound bus from Pennsylvania to Virginia, watching America pass by through scratched windows. The landscape had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The cars looked different, smoother, more plastic. The billboards advertised computers you could own, movies he'd never heard of, politicians whose faces were unfamiliar. In a rest stop bathroom somewhere in Maryland, he stared at himself in a cracked mirror and barely recognized the man looking back. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His face was thinner, harder. His eyes carried the particular emptiness of someone who had learned to see without being seen. He was 43 years old, and he felt like a ghost visiting from another lifetime. The address he carried in his pocket was the same one he'd left behind in 1975, a small brick house on Maple Drive in Arlington, Virginia. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a yard with a dogwood tree. He and his wife Sarah had bought it in 1972, back when he was still working as a communications analyst for a Defense Department contractor. Back when his security clearance was active and his future seemed predictable. Back when the world made sense. The house was paid off by the time he went to prison. Sarah had promised to wait. She'd written him letters for the first 3 years. Awkward, distant letters that grew shorter and less frequent until they stopped entirely in 1978. He hadn't heard from her in 8 years, but the house was still legally half his. That much, at least, should remain. The bus dropped him at the Arlington station just after sunset. He walked the rest of the way, his paper bag under one arm, following streets that memory insisted should be familiar but somehow weren't. The neighborhood had aged. Some houses had been renovated, their facades modernized with new siding and bigger windows. Others had fallen into quiet disrepair. The trees were taller. The streetlights hummed with a different pitch. When he finally turned onto Maple Drive, his heart began to pound with something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite fear. It was the feeling of a man approaching a border he wasn't sure he'd be allowed to cross. The house looked exactly as he remembered it. Same red brick, same white shutters, same concrete path leading to the front door. There was a car in the driveway he didn't recognize, a blue sedan, American-made, maybe 3 years old. The porch light was on. Through the front window he could see the warm glow of lamps, the flicker of a television. Someone was home. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, rehearsing words he'd thought about for 11 years. Then he walked up the path and knocked on the door. The man who answered was not someone David had ever seen before. He was in his late 30s, with sandy hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing jeans and a Virginia Tech sweatshirt. He looked at David with the polite confusion of someone greeting an unexpected salesman. "Can I help you?" the man asked. David's throat felt dry. "I'm looking for Sarah Ashford. This is her house." The man's confusion deepened. "I'm sorry, but there's no Sarah here. You might have the wrong address." "No," David said, more firmly than he intended. "This is 114 Maple Drive. I'm sure of it." The man glanced back into the house, then stepped onto the porch, closing the door slightly behind him. "Look, I don't know who you're looking for, but my wife and I have lived here for 6 years. We bought it from a couple named Henderson. Before that, I don't know. Maybe your friend moved." David felt the world tilt slightly. 6 years? That's right. The man was starting to look uncomfortable. "Is there something else I can help you with?" "I used to live here," David said quietly. "This was my house. I bought it in 1972. The man's face changed. Something between suspicion and pity flickered across it. "I think you're mistaken. Like I said, we bought it from the Hendersons in 1980. There's no record of anyone else." David felt his pulse in his temples. "I need to come inside. I need to see." "That's not going to happen." The man's voice had gone flat. "I don't know who you are or what you're trying to do, but you need to leave. Now. You don't understand. I understand fine. You need to go, or I'm calling the police." David stood there for one more moment, staring at the man who lived in his house, trying to find words for something that had no words. Then he turned and walked back down the path, his paper bag still under his arm, his release check still in his pocket. Behind him, he heard the door close and the sound of a deadbolt sliding into place. He walked for an hour without direction, processing what had just happened. By the time he found himself standing in front of a payphone outside a shuttered gas station, it was nearly 9 o'clock. The air had turned cold. His hands were shaking, not from temperature, but from something deeper. He fed quarters into the phone and dialed the number he'd memorized before his trial. The emergency contact his handler had given him in case anything ever went wrong. The number rang 4 times. Then, connected to a recorded message, "The number you have reached is no longer in service." He tried the backup number. Same message. He tried the number for the Defense Department contractor where he'd worked. A recorded voice informed him that the company had been dissolved in 1982, its contracts absorbed by other firms. He tried information, asking for Sarah Ashford in Arlington, Virginia. The operator came back after a moment. "I'm sorry, sir. No listing under that name." He hung up the phone and stood in the glow of the streetlight, watching his breath cloud in the March air. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. A car passed by without slowing. The city hummed with the sound of a million lives being lived by people who belonged here, who had addresses and phone numbers and connections to the world. David Ashford had none of those things. He had a name that apparently appeared in no records, a house that belonged to strangers, a wife who had vanished, and a past that, according to every official channel, did not exist. The first night he slept in a Salvation Army shelter in southeast D.C., lying on a narrow cot surrounded by men who asked no questions. The second day he went to the Arlington County Courthouse and requested property records for 114 Maple Drive. The clerk, a tired woman in her 50s, pulled the microfiche and showed him the history. The house had been sold by Robert and Catherine Henderson to the current owners in January 1980. Before that, the Hendersons had purchased it in March 1975 from a couple named Ashford, David and Sarah. "That's me," David said, pointing to his own name on the record. "David Ashford. I never sold that house." The clerk looked at him over her reading glasses. "The signature's right here, notarized in everything. I was in prison in March of 1975. I couldn't have signed anything." The clerk's expression didn't change. "Then you should probably talk to a lawyer. I just keep the records." He tried to find a lawyer willing to take his case. The first 3 he called refused once they heard the word espionage. The 4th agreed to meet him for a consultation, listened to his story for 20 minutes, then stood up and said, "Mr. Ashford, whatever happened to you, it's above my pay grade. I can't help you. And honestly, for your own safety, you should probably let this go." "Let what go? My house? My life?" The lawyer looked at him with something close to sympathy. "You were convicted of espionage in a classified trial. Your records are sealed. The people who did this to you, whoever they are, they're not the kind of people you win against in court. Take the money from wherever you can get it and start over somewhere else. That's my advice." David walked out of the office and stood on the street corner, watching people pass by. People with jobs and homes and names that appeared in phone books. The lawyer was probably right. He should disappear. Go to another city, change his name, find work under the table, live quiet and small and invisible. That would be the smart thing, the safe thing. But David Ashford had spent 11 years in a cell thinking about the moment he would come home. He had endured solitary confinement, threats, interrogations designed to break him, and he had survived by holding on to one simple truth: he was innocent. He had done what his country asked him to do, and he had been betrayed for it. Someone had taken his life, not just his freedom but his actual existence, and replaced him with a blank space. And now they expected him to walk away. He wasn't going to do that. The next morning, he went to the Library of Congress. If his records were classified, he would start with the things that weren't. He pulled newspaper archives from 1975, searching for any mention of his trial. He found nothing. He searched for his name in every database the library had access to. Nothing. He pulled city directories, phone books, employment records. His name appeared until March 1975, then vanished as if he had never existed. Sarah's name followed the same pattern. She was listed at their address through early 1975, then disappeared entirely. He sat in the reading room until closing time, surrounded by books and microfilm, trying to understand the shape of what had been done to him. Erasing someone from the public record wasn't easy. It required coordination across multiple agencies, falsified documents, bribes, or threats to ensure silence from anyone who might remember. This wasn't the work of ordinary criminals. This was institutional, professional, the kind of thing that required resources and authority that only a government possessed. The question was why. He had been arrested in February 1975, charged with passing classified information to a foreign intelligence service. The specific details were never made public. His trial lasted 3 days, all of it behind closed doors. The prosecution presented evidence he was never allowed to see. His lawyer, a court-appointed attorney who seemed to know he was fighting a losing battle, advised him to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. David refused. He was innocent. He had done his job exactly as instructed, following protocols established by his handler. A man named Richard Cole, who worked for an office within the Defense Department that David understood to be connected to CIA operations. Everything he had done was authorized. Everything had been part of an operation he believed was legitimate. The jury convicted him in 40 minutes. At sentencing, the judge said, "Mr. Ashford, you have betrayed your country in a time of great peril. The damage you have caused is immeasurable. You will serve 15 years in federal prison. And you should consider yourself fortunate that the penalty is not more severe." David tried to appeal. The appellate court refused to hear the case, citing national security concerns. His lawyer filed motions to unseal the evidence. All denied. He wrote letters to congressmen, senators, the Department of Justice. None were answered. After 3 years, he stopped trying. He accepted that he would serve his time, and when he was released, he would find a way to prove his innocence. But now, sitting in the library with the weight of 11 years pressing down on him, he understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't about guilt or innocence. This was about erasure. Someone had decided that David Ashford was inconvenient, and they had removed him not just from freedom, but from existence itself. And they had done it so thoroughly that even his release from prison hadn't restored him. He was a ghost, and ghosts don't win lawsuits. That night, he returned to the shelter. He lay on his cot, staring at the stained ceiling tiles, and made a decision. If the system wouldn't give him answers, he would find them himself. He had been trained as an intelligence analyst. He knew how to follow patterns, how to identify connections, how to find the truth hidden inside layers of deception. Someone had stolen his life. He was going to find out who and why, and what they had done with the man he used to be. The next morning, he went to the Arlington Public Library and started building a timeline. He wrote everything he could remember about the months leading up to his arrest. The operations he had worked on, the people he had briefed, the documents he had handled, the conversations he had overheard. He filled notebook pages with names, dates, locations, trying to construct a map of his own past. Richard Cole, his handler, the man who had recruited him, trained him, and given him his assignments. Cole had worked out of an unmarked office in Crystal City, operating under commercial cover as a consultant for defense contractors. He had been in his mid-40s then, which would make him in his mid-50s now. David wrote down everything he remembered about Cole. his appearance, his habits, the way he spoke, the places they used to meet. Operation Winter Harvest. That was the code name for the project David had been working on when he was arrested. He didn't know its full scope. He was just one small piece of a much larger machine, but his role involved analyzing Soviet communications intercepts and identifying patterns in their diplomatic traffic. Specifically, he had been looking at messages between Moscow and its embassy in Mexico City, trying to map networks of influence and identify potential assets. It was delicate work, the kind that required patience and attention to detail. And somewhere in that work he had apparently done something that warranted his destruction. He remembered the last assignment Cole had given him. It was early February 1975. Cole had handed him a folder containing transcripts of intercepted telephone calls between a Soviet diplomat in Mexico City and a contact in Washington. The contact's name had been redacted, but the content suggested someone with access to NATO military planning documents. Cole told him to analyze the transcripts and identify any patterns that might reveal the contact's identity. David had worked on it for 2 weeks. He found patterns, linguistic tics, timing of calls, references to specific policy debates that narrowed the field. He wrote a report identifying 3 possible suspects, all of them mid-level Pentagon analysts with the appropriate clearances. He gave the report to Cole on February 20th. 5 days later, FBI agents arrested him at his home. The charges never mentioned the Mexico City intercepts. They never mentioned Operation Winter Harvest. Instead, they accused him of passing classified satellite imagery to East German intelligence through a cutout in Vienna. He had never been to Vienna. He had never worked with satellite imagery. Nothing in the charges bore any relationship to the work he had actually been doing. Sitting in the library, David felt the pieces begin to align. He had been set up. The Mexico City intercepts had revealed something someone didn't want revealed. His report had identified suspects who were protected. And rather than allow him to continue, they had removed him, framed him with fabricated charges, convicted him in a closed trial where no defense was possible, and then erased him so thoroughly that even his release wouldn't allow him to speak. But who? Who had the power to orchestrate something like that? And why go to such lengths? Why not just kill him? An accident, a suicide, a heart attack, any of those would have been simpler and more permanent. Unless they needed him alive. Unless keeping him in prison served some purpose that killing him wouldn't. He spent 3 more days in the library, searching for any mention of the names he remembered. Richard Cole appeared nowhere. The Defense Department contractor he had worked for, Stratton Analytics Group, had been dissolved in 1982. Its records absorbed by the Pentagon. Operation Winter Harvest appeared in no public document. The Soviet diplomat in Mexico City whose calls he had analyzed, a man named Oleg Suslov, had been recalled to Moscow in 1976 and died. There, under unclear circumstances in 1978, every lead was a dead end. Every name had been scrubbed or silenced. On the 4th day, he found something. It was a small item in the Washington Post from November 1975, buried on page 12. A State Department analyst named Gordon Fletcher had died in a car accident on the George Washington Parkway. Single vehicle collision, late at night, no witnesses. Fletcher had been 41 years old, survived by his wife and 2 daughters. The article mentioned that he had recently been promoted to a senior position in the European Affairs Bureau. David stared at the name Gordon Fletcher. He had been one of the 3 suspects in his report. One of the 3 possible sources for the Soviet diplomat in Mexico City. He pulled every article he could find about Fletcher's death. There weren't many. The accident was treated as a tragic but unremarkable event. His funeral was attended by State Department colleagues. His wife gave a brief statement thanking people for their condolences. The case was closed within a week. David made a note and kept searching. The second suspect, a woman named Patricia Hollis, appeared in the news briefly in 1977, when she was quietly dismissed from her position at the Pentagon for health reasons. She moved to Oregon and disappeared from public records after that. The third suspect, a man named Andrew Marsh, had a longer career. He rose steadily through the Pentagon hierarchy, eventually becoming Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO Policy in 1984. He was still in that position now, according to the most recent directory David could find. One dead in a suspicious accident. One forced out and vanished. One promoted to a position of significant power. David sat back in his chair, feeling the cold clarity that came when a pattern revealed itself. Marsh. Andrew Marsh was the source. He had been feeding information to the Soviets, and David's report had identified him. But instead of being arrested, Marsh had been protected. The evidence had been buried. The analyst who found it had been neutralized. And everyone else who might have known had been either eliminated or silenced. But why protect a traitor? What could Marsh have offered that was worth destroying an innocent man and allowing him to continue his work? The only possible answer was that Marsh wasn't a traitor. Or rather, he was a traitor working for someone on the American side, a double agent, a controlled source of disinformation, a player in a game so complex that exposing him would have damaged something more important than justice. And David Ashford, in his careful analysis, had stumbled onto something he was never meant to see. Not the traitor, the protection, the conspiracy, the rot at the center of the machine. That was why they had destroyed him. Not because he was guilty, but because he was innocent, and therefore dangerous. He left the library as the sun was setting and walked through the city, letting the pieces settle into place. He had been a loyal analyst doing his job, and his competence had made him a threat. They couldn't kill him without raising questions. They couldn't let him continue his work, so they had done the only thing they could. They had made him guilty of something else. Something unrelated, something classified enough that no one would ever be able to examine the truth. And then they had erased him, removing every trace of his existence so that even if he someday told his story, no one would believe him. It was elegant in its cruelty. It was thorough. And it had almost worked. But they had made one mistake. They had let him live. And now he was free, and he knew what had been done to him, and he knew who to look for. Andrew Marsh. The man who had stolen his life was sitting in an office in the Pentagon, making policy decisions that affected millions of people. Protected by layers of security and bureaucracy and the assumption that men like him were above suspicion. David stood on a street corner in Arlington, watching traffic pass by, and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to disappear. He was going to find a way to reach Andrew Marsh. And he was going to make him answer for what he had done. Not with violence. Not with revenge, but with truth. Even if the truth destroyed him. The problem with confronting a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense was that men in such positions existed behind walls that ordinary citizens could not penetrate. David Ashford could not simply walk into the Pentagon and demand an audience. He had no credentials, no connections, no leverage. He was a convicted spy living in a homeless shelter with $200 and a name that appeared in no official record. He was less than nobody. He was a ghost who had forgotten he was dead. But ghosts have one advantage. They can move through walls that stop living men. David spent the next week studying Andrew Marsh the way he had once studied Soviet communications patterns. He went to the library every morning and stayed until closing, pulling every public document he could find. Congressional testimony, policy papers, news articles quoting Marsh on European security issues, photographs from State Department functions. He built a profile looking for vulnerabilities, patterns, anything that might offer a way in. Marsh was 51 years old, married for 26 years to a woman named Eleanor who came from old Philadelphia money. 2 children, both grown and living on the East Coast. He lived in McLean, Virginia, in a house worth more than David would earn in 5 lifetimes. He drove a Mercedes. He belonged to an exclusive country club. He was, by every measure, untouchable. But everyone has routines. And routines create opportunities. David found what he needed in a society column from the previous year. The article mentioned that Andrew and Eleanor Marsh were longtime supporters of the Kennedy Center, with season tickets to the National Symphony Orchestra. Performances were held Friday and Saturday evenings, September through May. It was now mid-March. The season was still active. David checked the Kennedy Center schedule. The National Symphony was performing Mahler's Fifth Symphony that Friday at 8 o'clock. He had no way to know if Marsh would attend, but it was a possibility. And possibilities were all he had. He took the bus to Georgetown on Friday afternoon and walked along the Potomac until he reached the Kennedy Center. The building rose against the gray sky like a monument to a civilization that believed in permanence. David had been there once before, in 1973, when Sarah had surprised him with tickets to see Bernstein conduct. He remembered the feeling of standing in the grand foyer, surrounded by people in elegant clothes, feeling like he belonged to something larger than himself. That feeling was gone now. He stood outside in clothes from 1975 that marked him as poor and out of place, watching expensive cars pull up to the entrance and disgorge their passengers. He couldn't go inside. He had no ticket, no money to buy one, and security would remove him the moment he tried to enter. But he didn't need to go inside. He just needed to be here when people left. He waited in the parking garage, hidden between concrete pillars, watching the entrance. The performance would last approximately 90 minutes. Intermission at 9:30. Final curtain around 10:15. He had time. The March air was cold and damp. His thin jacket offered little protection. He had not eaten since morning, a meal of watery oatmeal and burnt toast at the shelter. His stomach cramped with hunger, but he ignored it. He had learned to ignore many things in prison. Physical discomfort was nothing compared to the discipline required to survive 11 years with your mind intact. At 9:30, people began emerging for intermission, stepping outside to smoke or get air. David watched from the shadows, scanning faces. He saw senators, lobbyists, corporate executives, the kind of people who shaped policy over cocktails and made decisions that rippled through millions of lives. He saw their comfort, their ease, their absolute certainty that the world was built for them. Marsh did not appear during intermission. At 10:20, the performance ended and the crowd began to flow out. David moved closer to the entrance, positioning himself where he could see without being obvious. The people emerging were relaxed, satisfied, discussing the performance with the casual expertise of regular attendees. He watched their faces, comparing them to the photographs he had memorized. And then he saw him. Andrew Marsh emerged from the entrance with his wife on his arm. He was taller than David had expected. Silver-haired and distinguished in a dark suit that probably cost more than a month's salary. His wife wore pearls and a black dress that spoke of wealth so secure it never needed to announce itself. They moved through the crowd with the fluid grace of people accustomed to being recognized but not bothered, protected by an invisible barrier of status. David stepped forward, intercepting their path. "Mr. Marsh." Marsh stopped, his expression shifting from pleasant contentment to polite curiosity. He looked at David the way wealthy men look at panhandlers, with a mixture of pity and caution. "Yes, my name is David Ashford. I need to speak with you." Marsh's face changed. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, or perhaps fear. But it passed so quickly that David might have imagined it. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" "No, but you should. I'm the man who identified you in February of 1975. Marsh's wife touched his arm. "Andrew, what's this about?" Marsh's expression had settled into something carefully neutral. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ashford, but I think you have me confused with someone else. I don't know what you're talking about." Operation Winter Harvest. The Mexico City intercepts. You were passing information to Oleg Suslov through a cutout in the Soviet embassy. I wrote the report that identified you. 5 days later, I was arrested for espionage and spent 11 years in prison while you continued your career. People were starting to notice the confrontation. A security guard near the entrance was looking their direction. Marsh's wife had gone pale. "Andrew, who is this man?" Marsh's voice remained calm, but something had hardened in his eyes. "I have no idea." "Sir, I think you need to leave. You're clearly disturbed and you're making my wife uncomfortable." "I'm disturbed?" David heard his voice rising and forced it down. "You destroyed my life. You took my house, my wife, my name. You erased me. And you've been living in comfort while I rotted in a cell for crimes I didn't commit." The security guard was moving toward them now, speaking into a radio. Marsh put his arm around his wife's shoulders, steering her toward the parking garage. "Andrew," David called after him, "I know what you are. I know what they protected. And I'm going to prove it." Marsh stopped and turned back. For just a moment the mask slipped, and David saw something raw underneath. Not fear, something colder. "Mr. Ashford," Marsh said quietly, "I suggest you be very careful about the accusations you make. You're a convicted felon with obvious psychological problems. No one will believe anything you say. Go home, get help, and stay away from me and my family." Then he turned and walked away, his wife clutched close to his side, disappearing into the shadows of the parking garage. The security guard reached David a moment later. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave the premises." David didn't resist. He had accomplished what he came for. He had looked Andrew Marsh in the eye and seen the truth. Marsh knew exactly who he was. Marsh knew what had been done, and Marsh was afraid. That fear was leverage. David took the bus back to the shelter, his mind racing. The confrontation had confirmed everything, but it had also revealed how powerless he actually was. Marsh was right. David was a convicted felon with no credibility, no resources, no way to force anyone to listen. He could scream the truth from street corners and no one would care. He could write letters to newspapers and they would be ignored. He was shouting into a void, and the void was indifferent. But there had to be a way. There had to be someone who would listen. Someone who had the authority to investigate. Someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. He thought about Richard Cole, his old handler. Cole had been part of the operation. Cole had given him the Mexico City intercepts. Cole must have known what would happen when David submitted his report. Either Cole had been part of the setup, or Cole had been played just like David. If Cole was still alive, if he could be found, he might have answers. Or he might be the proof David needed. But how to find a man who worked in the shadows? David spent the next 3 days searching for any trace of Richard Cole. He checked old Defense Department directories, contractor listings, corporate records. He found nothing. Cole had vanished just as thoroughly as David himself. Either he was dead, or he had disappeared into whatever black hole consumed people who knew too much. On the 4th day, David tried a different approach. He went to the National Archives and requested records related to Operation Winter Harvest under the Freedom of Information Act. The archivist, a young man with thick glasses, looked at him skeptically. "You know these requests can take months, right? Sometimes years. And if it's classified, you probably won't get anything." "I know," David said. "But I need to try." He filled out the forms, providing his name and the address of the shelter. The archivist stamped them and added them to a pile of similar requests. "Don't hold your breath," the young man said. David walked out of the archives building and stood on the steps, looking across the mall toward the Capitol. Somewhere in this city, in filing cabinets and computer databases and sealed vaults, the truth existed. Documents that proved what had been done to him. Files that contained the real story of Operation Winter Harvest. Evidence that could exonerate him and expose the conspiracy that had destroyed his life. But all of it was locked away, protected by classification systems designed to keep secrets buried forever. He could file 1,000 FOIA requests and never see a single page. He could spend the rest of his life searching and die without answers. Unless he could find someone on the inside, someone with access, someone who believed in justice more than loyalty. That night, lying on his cot in the shelter, David made a list of every name he remembered from his old life. Colleagues from Stratton Analytics, other analysts he had worked with, secretaries, technicians, security officers, anyone who might have known Richard Cole or had access to classified files. The list filled 2 pages. Most of the names were probably useless. Most of those people had likely moved on, retired, died, or forgotten him entirely. But one of them might remember. One of them might still care. He started making phone calls the next morning using the shelter's payphone. Most of the numbers had been disconnected. The ones that still worked led to people who didn't remember him or claimed they didn't. A few hung up as soon as he mentioned his name. One woman, a former secretary named Gloria, listened to his story and then said gently, "David, I'm sorry for what happened to you. But I can't help you. None of us can. Please don't call here again." He was down to the last 3 names on his list when he reached someone who didn't hang up. The voice on the other end of the line was male, older, cautious. "Who is this?" "My name is David Ashford. I'm trying to reach Thomas Brennan. I worked with him at Stratton Analytics in the 70s. A long pause. "This is Tom Brennan. What do you want?" "I need to talk to you about Operation Winter Harvest, about what happened in 1975. Another pause, longer this time. "You shouldn't be calling me about this, I know, but I have nowhere else to turn. Tom, I was set up. I went to prison for something I didn't do, and the people who did it erased me. My house, my wife, my records, everything. I need help proving what happened." "Jesus Christ," Brennan muttered. "You're really alive. What does that mean?" "It means we were told you died in prison in 1979. Heart attack. That's what Richard Cole told me." David felt his chest tighten. "Cole said that?" "Yeah. He came by my office about 6 months after you were arrested. Said the whole thing was a terrible mistake, but there was nothing that could be done. Then a few years later, he mentioned you died. I didn't question it. Where is Cole now?" "I don't know. Haven't seen him since 1980. He left the contractor world, went to work directly for DOD, I think. But I lost track of him after that. Tom, I need to know what Operation Winter Harvest was really about." "What was I analyzing? What did my report reveal?" Brennan sighed. "David, I was just logistics. I didn't have clearance for operational details. I moved paper from one desk to another. But I remember there was panic after your arrest. People got transferred, files got sealed, the whole project got shut down within a month. Whatever you found, it scared someone badly. Andrew Marsh. That's who I found. He was the mole. I don't know anything about that. And honestly, I don't want to know." "David, listen to me. You're playing with fire. These aren't people who forgive and forget. If you keep pushing this, you're going to end up dead for real. I'm already dead, Tom. They killed me 11 years ago. They just forgot to bury the body. Then let them think you're buried. Disappear. Change your name. Go somewhere they'll never look. Live whatever life you have left. I can't do that. Why not? Because if I do, they win. And if they can do this to me, they can do it to anyone. Someone has to stand up and say no. Someone has to demand the truth." Brennan was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was sad. "You were always the idealistic one. That's probably why they targeted you. People like us, we know how to keep our heads down. But you actually believed in the mission. I still do. Then you're going to die believing in something that doesn't exist. Good luck, David. I'm sorry I can't help you." The line went dead. David stood in the hallway of the shelter holding the receiver, listening to the dial tone. Brennan was probably right. He was tilting at windmills, fighting battles that couldn't be won, refusing to accept reality. The smart thing would be to walk away. The sane thing would be to start over. But sanity was a luxury for people who still believed the system worked. He hung up the phone and went back to his cot. He lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about what Brennan had said. Richard Cole had told people David was dead. That meant Cole had been keeping track, at least for a few years. That meant Cole had cared enough to monitor the situation. And that meant Cole might still care, if David could find him. The next morning, David went back to the Library of Congress and started searching for Richard Cole in a different way. If Cole had gone to work directly for the Defense Department, there might be a paper trail. Contract awards, budget documents, personnel directories. He pulled everything he could find related to DOD intelligence operations between 1976 and 1986. It took 3 days, but he found a reference. A contract awarded in 1981 to a consulting firm called Meridian Strategic Group for analytical support services related to Warsaw Pact communications. Intelligence. The contract was worth $4 million over 3 years. And buried in the appendix was a list of senior personnel. Richard Cole was listed as Director of Analysis. David wrote down the address. Meridian Strategic Group was based in Tysons Corner, Virginia. He took the bus there the next day and found the building, a generic glass and steel tower that could have housed any of 1,000 anonymous corporations. The directory in the lobby listed Meridian on the 7th floor. He took the elevator up and walked into a reception area decorated in corporate beige. A young woman behind the desk looked up at him with practiced politeness. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Richard Cole. I'm an old colleague. I'm sorry, but Mr. Cole is no longer with the company. He retired 2 years ago. Do you have a forwarding address? It's important that I reach him." The receptionist's smile became more fixed. "I'm not authorized to give out personal information. If you'd like to leave a message, I can see that it gets forwarded, please. It's urgent." "I'm sorry, sir. That's our policy." David stood there for a moment trying to think of something that would persuade her. But he had nothing. No authority, no connection, no leverage. He was just a strange man in old clothes asking questions that made people uncomfortable. He turned and walked back to the elevator, defeated. But as he waited for the elevator doors to open, he heard a voice behind him. "David?" He turned. A man was standing in the hallway, mid-50s, graying hair, wire-rimmed glasses. He wore slacks and a polo shirt, casual but expensive. He was staring at David with an expression that mixed shock and something else. Something that might have been guilt. "Richard," David said. Richard Cole glanced at the receptionist, then gestured toward a conference room down the hall. "Let's talk in private." They sat across from each other at a long table in a room with no windows. Cole folded his hands and looked at David with an expression that was hard to read. "They told me you were dead," Cole said finally. "Tom Brennan said the same thing. You told him I died in prison. That's what I was told. That's what everyone was told." Cole shook his head slowly. "Jesus, David, what happened to you? You know what happened to me. You were there. I know you were arrested. I know the trial was classified. But I was pulled off the operation the day after you were taken into custody. I was told it was a counterintelligence matter, that you'd been identified as a security risk, and that I was being reassigned for my own protection. They debriefed me for 3 days, made me sign non-disclosure agreements, and transferred me to a desk job in logistics. I asked questions, but no one would answer them. And then someone told me you died, and I had no reason to doubt it, until now." Cole nodded. "Until now. David, what do you want from me? The truth. What was Operation Winter Harvest really about?" Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot 7 stories below. "It was a penetration operation. We had an asset inside the Soviet embassy in Mexico City, someone feeding us transcripts of diplomatic communications. The material was good, but we knew the Soviets had penetrated our side too. Someone in Washington was passing them information about NATO planning. Your job was to identify the leak using pattern analysis of the intercepts, and I did." "Andrew Marsh." Cole turned to face him. "You identified 3 possible suspects. Ash was one of them. But before we could investigate further, the operation was shut down. You were arrested. The Mexico City asset was pulled. The whole thing was buried. Why? I don't know. I've spent 10 years trying to figure that out. Marsh is still working at the Pentagon. He's a deputy assistant secretary now. If he was the leak, why wasn't he prosecuted?" Cole sat back down, his face troubled. "There are only 2 possibilities. Either he wasn't the leak and your analysis was wrong, or he was the leak and someone protected him. Why would anyone protect a traitor? Because he wasn't a traitor. He was a controlled source. A double agent we were running against the Soviets. And you stumbled onto an operation that was so sensitive, so compartmented, that even people like me didn't know about it. Your report threatened to expose him, so they buried you instead." David felt something cold settle in his chest. "They destroyed my life to protect an operation. That's how it works sometimes. One man's sacrifice for the greater good. Except I didn't sacrifice myself. I was sacrificed. Without my knowledge, without my consent, without even being told why. Cole nodded slowly. I know, and I'm sorry. But David, you have to understand, this is bigger than you or me. These operations, they save lives. They prevent wars. The people making these decisions, they're not evil. They're just trying to protect the country. By framing innocent men, by making hard choices in impossible situations. David stared at him. You believe that? You really believe that what they did was justified? Cole looked away. I don't know what I believe anymore. I used to think I was serving something noble. Now I'm not sure, but I do know this. You can't win against them. You can't expose them. You can't shame them. You can't make them pay. The system protects itself. It always has. Then the system is corrupt, maybe. Or maybe it's just pragmatic. I don't have answers, David. I just have questions I stopped asking because the answers were too depressing. David stood up. I need proof. Documents. Files. Something that shows what really happened. There's nothing. Everything related to Winter Harvest was destroyed or sealed. Even if I wanted to help you, I couldn't access those records. They're beyond my clearance now. Then I'll find another way. Cole looked at him with something like pity. There is no other way. David, please, let this go. Take whatever money you can get. Start over somewhere else. You've already lost 11 years. Don't waste the rest of your life on a crusade you can't win. If I let this go, then what happened to me meant nothing. And if it meant nothing, then I have nothing left. Then find new meaning. Build a new life. You're still young enough. I could what? Pretend this didn't happen? Pretend I'm not a ghost? Pretend the world is just? David shook his head. I can't do that. Maybe you can. Maybe that's how you sleep at night. But I can't. He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the handle. One more question, David said. Did you know, when you gave me those intercepts, did you know what would happen? Cole's face crumbled. No. I swear to God, no. I thought it was a legitimate operation. I thought we were hunting a mole. I didn't know Marsh was protected. I didn't know they would sacrifice you. If I had known, I would have warned you. I would have done something, but you didn't do anything after. When I was arrested, when I was convicted, when I disappeared, you didn't do anything. What could I have done? I was just a contract officer. I had no authority, no power. I was told to keep quiet, and I kept quiet. I'm sorry, David. I'm truly sorry. But I couldn't save you. David opened the door. No one tried to save me. That's the problem. Everyone just kept quiet and followed orders and told themselves they had no choice. And so the machine kept running, grinding up whoever got in its way. He walked out, leaving Richard Cole sitting alone in the conference room. The bus ride back to D.C. felt longer than it was. David stared out the window, watching Virginia's suburbs blur past, thinking about what Cole had told him. A controlled source. A double agent. An operation so sensitive that an innocent man's life was an acceptable price to pay for its security. It made sense. It was logical in the cold calculus of intelligence work. But it was also monstrous. And the fact that people like Cole and Brennan could accept it, could live with it, could rationalize it as necessary, said something terrible about the world they had built. But knowing the why didn't change David's situation. He was still a ghost. He still had no proof. He still had no way to force anyone to acknowledge what had been done to him. Unless he could find the one thing that couldn't be denied: documentation. Somewhere, in some classified vault, the files existed. The original intercepts, the operation plans, the decision memos, the evidence that would prove everything Cole had just told him. The trick was finding someone who had access and was willing to risk everything to expose it. Someone like him. Someone who believed truth mattered more than security. Someone who no longer existed in any official record. David spent the next week planning. He couldn't access classified files himself, but he could create a situation where someone else would have to. A public accusation, a lawsuit, a complaint filed with the Inspector General. Something that would force an investigation, compel someone to look at the sealed files, create a paper trail that couldn't be erased. It would be a gamble. It might fail. It would almost certainly cost him whatever small freedom he had managed to reclaim. But it was the only move he had left. He drafted a detailed complaint outlining everything he knew about Operation Winter Harvest. Andrew Marsh, Richard Cole, and the events of 1975. He included every name, every date, every detail he could remember. He made 3 copies by hand, painstaking work that took days. He addressed one to the Defense Department Inspector General, one to the Senate Intelligence Committee, and one to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Before he mailed them, he went back to Arlington one more time. He stood on the sidewalk outside the house that used to be his, looking at the windows where strangers lived, and said goodbye to the life that had been taken from him. He would never get it back. Sarah was gone, lost to him in ways that went beyond simple distance. The house belonged to someone else. The world had moved on without him. But he could still fight for the principle of the thing. He could still demand that someone acknowledge what had been done. He walked to the post office and mailed all 3 letters. Then he waited. 3 weeks passed. No response. No acknowledgement. No indication that anyone was reading his complaints or taking them seriously. He checked the shelter's phone line every day, asking if anyone had called for him. No one had. He was beginning to think the letters had been intercepted, buried before they could reach anyone who mattered, when the man appeared. David was walking back from the library one afternoon when a black sedan pulled up beside him. The window rolled down, and a man in his early 30s, wearing a dark suit and sunglasses, looked out at him. "David Ashford?" David stopped walking. "Who's asking? Get in the car, please. Someone wants to talk to you." "I don't think so." The man removed his sunglasses. His eyes were cold and professional. "Mr. Ashford, this isn't a request. You've been making accusations that involve classified programs and sensitive personnel. The people who oversee these matters would like to discuss your concerns in a secure setting. You can come voluntarily, or we can make this more difficult. Your choice." David looked up and down the street. No one was paying attention. No one would notice if he was taken. No one would care. "Am I under arrest?" "No. You're being invited to a meeting, and if I refuse, then we'll find another time and place for this conversation. But it will happen, Mr. Ashford, one way or another." David stood there for a moment, considering his options. He had none. He got in the car. They drove for 40 minutes, heading west into Virginia, taking roads David didn't recognize. The man in the suit said nothing, and David didn't bother asking questions. Eventually, they turned onto an unmarked access road that led to a compound surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. A guard station checked the driver's credentials, and the gate opened. They parked in front of a low concrete building that could have been anything: a warehouse, an office complex, a bunker. The man led David inside, through halls painted institutional gray, past doors with cipher locks and security cameras. At the end of a long corridor, they stopped at an unmarked door. The man knocked twice and opened it. Inside was a small conference room, a table, 4 chairs, no windows. A single person was waiting, an older man in a civilian suit, gray-haired and weary-looking. He gestured to a chair. "Mr. Ashford, please, sit down." David sat. The younger man closed the door and stood against it, hands folded. The older man opened a folder on the table. Inside, David could see copies of his letters. "My name is Douglas Harmon. I'm with the Defense Department Office of Security. I've been asked to review your complaints regarding Operation Winter Harvest and certain allegations you've made about personnel within the department." He looked at David with eyes that revealed nothing. "These are serious accusations, Mr. Ashford. Before we proceed, I need to understand what you hope to accomplish. I want the truth acknowledged. I want my name cleared. I want the people who destroyed my life held accountable." Harmon nodded slowly. "I understand. However, there are complications. The operation you've referenced is still classified at the highest levels. Even confirming its existence would require disclosures that could damage national security. So, you're saying you won't investigate. I'm saying that any investigation would have to be conducted within carefully controlled parameters. We can't simply declassify sensitive programs because one individual believes he was wronged. I don't believe I was wronged. I know I was. I have witnesses. Richard Cole admitted it to my face. Mr. Cole has been debriefed. He confirms that you worked for Stratton Analytics and that you were arrested in 1975. Beyond that, he has no knowledge of the charges against you or the reasons for your conviction. He certainly made no admission of conspiracy. David felt his stomach drop. Cole had been debriefed. They'd gotten to him already, made sure his story aligned with theirs. He's lying. Or you're forcing him to lie. Mr. Ashford, no one is forcing anyone to do anything. We're simply trying to understand the facts. And the facts, as they currently stand, are these. You were convicted of espionage in a lawful trial. You served your sentence and were released. You now claim the conviction was unjust. But you have no evidence to support that claim beyond your own testimony. What about Andrew Marsh? What about the Mexico City intercepts? Mr. Marsh is a respected public servant with over 30 years of distinguished service. The documents you reference are classified and cannot be discussed in this setting. Without access to those documents, your allegations amount to speculation. Then give me access. Declassify the files. Let an independent investigator review them. Harmon closed the folder. That's not going to happen. Mr. Ashford, I'm going to be frank with you. You've stumbled into areas that are beyond your understanding and beyond your clearance. The work we do in the intelligence community involves difficult choices. Sometimes people get hurt. Sometimes those people are innocent. It's tragic, but it's also necessary to protect the larger mission, so you admit it. You admit I was innocent. I'm not admitting anything, I'm explaining reality. You were caught in something larger than yourself. You paid a price. It's unfortunate, but it's done. Nothing you do now will change what happened. The best thing you can do is accept that and move on. Accept that my government destroyed me for doing my job correctly. Accept that the world is complicated and justice is not always possible. David stood up. I won't accept that. I can't. Harmon looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. Then you're going to have a difficult life, Mr. Ashford, because the world doesn't care about your pain. It will keep turning whether you accept it or not. Then I'll keep fighting until it stops. Harmon shook his head. Fighting will accomplish nothing except more suffering for yourself. But if you insist on continuing down this path, let me be clear about the consequences. If you make your allegations public, if you go to the press or attempt to expose classified information, you will be prosecuted again. Your parole status makes you vulnerable. We can put you back in prison for any violation, real or perceived. You could spend the rest of your life behind bars. Is that what you want? What I want is the truth. The truth is classified, and it will stay that way. This meeting is over, Mr. Ashford. You'll be driven back to the city. My advice to you is to forget this conversation happened and get on with your life. But the choice, ultimately, is yours. The younger man opened the door. David walked out, down the gray hallway, back to the car. They drove him to Arlington and dropped him off 3 blocks from the shelter. As he walked away, the sedan pulled away and disappeared into traffic. David stood on the corner watching the city move around him and understood that he had lost. They weren't going to acknowledge what they'd done. They weren't going to declassify the files. They weren't going to admit that Andrew Marsh was a double agent and David Ashford was an innocent man sacrificed to protect him. They had the power to bury the truth forever, and they were going to use it. He had no resources, no allies, no legal standing. He was one man against an institution that had survived decades of scandals and emerged stronger each time. Fighting them would accomplish nothing except his own destruction. Richard Cole had been right. Tom Brennan had been right. Douglas Harmon had been right. He couldn't win. But as he walked through the streets of Arlington, past the houses where normal people lived normal lives, he realized something that made him smile, despite everything. Winning wasn't the point. The point was refusing to be silent. The point was making them acknowledge, even if only in secret meetings and classified memos, that what they had done was wrong. The point was being the grain of sand in the machine that refused to be smoothed away. They had taken his house, his wife, his name, his freedom. They had taken 11 years of his life and tried to erase him from history. But they hadn't taken his voice. And as long as he had that, he could still tell the truth, even if no one was listening. He went back to the shelter and wrote one more letter. Not to government agencies this time. To a journalist at the Washington Post who had written about intelligence abuses in the past. He told his story in careful detail, without embellishment, just the facts as he knew them. He mailed it the next morning. It would probably be ignored, or killed by editors who didn't want to touch classified operations, or result in phone calls from security agencies that would make the journalists think twice. But it was out there now. A record, a statement, a refusal. David Ashford had lived in the house at 114 Maple Drive. He had worked for Stratton Analytics. He had been convicted of crimes he didn't commit. And he would not be forgotten, even if the only person who remembered was himself. 3 months later, a small article appeared on page 17 of the Washington Post. It was only 300 words, and it didn't mention David by name. But it referenced allegations from an anonymous source about a Cold War-era intelligence operation that may have resulted in wrongful convictions. The Defense Department declined to comment, citing classification concerns. The article ended with a quote from a former CIA officer. "Intelligence work requires difficult choices. Sometimes innocent people suffer. That's the price of security." David read it in the library and then carefully folded the page and put it in his pocket. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't justice. But it was acknowledgement, however small. He walked out into the sunlight and headed toward the National Mall. He had nowhere to go and nothing to do. But that didn't matter anymore. He was alive. He had a voice. And somewhere, in sealed files and classified memos, the truth existed. Someday, perhaps long after he was dead, those files would be declassified. Someone would read the reports about Operation Winter Harvest and wonder about the analyst who was sacrificed to protect it. Someone would see his name and ask what happened to David Ashford, and the answer would be there, waiting in the archives. He had lived. He had told the truth. And he had refused to disappear. That would have to be enough. If stories like this make you reflect on the cost of secrets and the fragility of justice, consider subscribing to Cold War Stories. There are many more tallies of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances that deserve to be remembered. And we're committed to making sure they never fade from history.